At Home with the Gas Giants, Part 2, Chapter 1, Breakfast. Burlam's dream involved his wandering the darkened hallways of his old high school. When the alarm clock went off, the first thing that went through his mind was, "But then I didn't go to college." He jerked the covers to one side and threw his legs up in the air, bringing himself to a standing position as his feet came down. His wife was already up. Her sleep needs were minimal, as she was mostly robotic. Burlam could smell the breakfast she was preparing for him as he made his way to the toilet for the first urination of the day. Many more would follow. Burlam was a great water drinker. His wife's name was Niagara. She was soft like a human person, but perhaps a little too soft. Burlam could sink his fingers into her flesh like a man squeezing a Nerf football. This didn't bother him too much. He enjoyed the reliability of a robotic wife. "What's for breakfast?" he asked as he entered the kitchen. There are people who eat the same thing for breakfast every day, but Burlam was not one of them. "Monkey bread," Niagara replied. She wore pants that looked like jeans, but were made of material far too thin to be really called denim. She wore a plaid button-up shirt tied up in the middle so that her all-too-fake navel was displayed. Her face was nondescript. It could have been any Barbie doll in the world. Not that she was as good-looking as Barbie. From a coldly objective viewpoint, Barbie is good-looking. But the face was too symmetrical and characterless to have any depth of personality. Again, this didn't bother Burlam, for he had gotten used to Niagara's face, accepting it as one accepts one's mother's face, as safe and inviting, even when you have an ugly mother. Homemade monkey bread? Burlam wondered as he embraced his wife. She never rebuffed his embraces or his kisses. She even initiated both at perfectly appropriate times, although the latter tended to be a little drier and slightly stiffer than those provided by a biological woman. "No," Niagara replied. Whatever her shortcomings, her voice was perfect. Its inflections and tone were exactly what one expected, what one required. She sounded slightly apologetic now. "It's a frozen thing from the store. All you have to do is heat it up and apply the glaze." "Doesn't sound like much of a time saver," Burlam reflected as he poured a cup of coffee. Later that day he was to consider how he might have gotten angry at a human wife for wasting money on such a purchase. Why did he not feel the same need to display frustration at Niagara? Perhaps if he had went to college, studied philosophy or psychology, he might have been able to work it out. "It was just something to try," Niagara explained, turning to the oven and removing the monkey bread from inside. Burlam did not come to the breakfast table fully dressed. He always ate it in his sleep clothes and got ready for work afterwards. There was no newspaper to read. The radio was on, tuned to the local public radio station. It was Pledge Week, when the station tried to get listeners to help pay for its programming. Burlam never contributed. Turn that off, will you?" he added the "will you" as a means of softening his command. Even though Niagara was a robot and technically his property, he never mistreated her or was an insufferable overlord. At least he never acted that way unthinkingly or out of malice. He tried to be a normal husband to what he thought of as a normal wife. Conversation with wife. Niagara was, as I have said, mostly robotic. The parts of her that were not robotic were those fleshy bits inside her which allowed her to eat food more or less normally and process it for nutrients. Burlam preferred it this way. 9 times out of 10, as he often said, he'd rather eat than fuck. Sharing the pleasures of food with his wife was one of the things that contributed to the realism of their marriage. Of course, their marriage was perfectly legal. Hard-won changes to the law had seen to that some years before. There were those who chose robotic wives that did not eat, but Burlam liked to think that they were the same men who tried to keep robot marriages illegal in the first place. "Are you glad you married me?" Burlam asked Niagara. This was not entirely foolish, for, as we have seen in the case of the monkey bread purchase, Niagara had some measure of free will. She was incapable of poisoning her husband or embarking on an affair, but within certain limits she was an autonomous person. "Of course I am." Niagara's smile was as reassuring as the sunrise. She took a bite of the monkey bread. "I'm glad," Burlam told her. "That makes me feel good." "I know. I think you're right." Burlam raised his eyebrows. "This monkey bread isn't demonstrably better than homemade." Burlam said, "I haven't tried it yet," and took up a piece. He ate it with a fork instead of pulling it apart as suggested on the packaging. He chewed. "Well, it's not any worse," he decided. "Oh, well, I guess it was a waste of money." "I never said it was a waste of money. I said it was not a time saver." Burlam actually felt that time and money were interchangeable. His personal theory was that money had been invented as a way to quantify the life of individuals. It was the original means of extending one's influence and presence beyond the grave, long before the invention of photography, the phonograph, or the novel. But none of this, he felt, would be a rewarding topic of conversation, so he quickly continued by asking, "What are you going to do today?" Niagara sipped her orange juice. "I thought I'd work on those gutters," she replied, putting down her glass. "This will be the last season we have to clean them out. I'm going to cover them over with screen mesh. It lets the water in, but keeps the leaves and trash out." "Where'd you ever get an idea like that?" Burlum sounded amazed. "I read it in a Martha Stewart magazine." "Well, I'll be. What a great idea," Burlum considered. "How are you going to secure the screening?" "Staple gun." "You're going to be up on a ladder?" "Of course. We'll be careful." "I will." "I don't want anything to happen to you." Burlum got up from his chair and came around the table. He gave Niagara a kiss. He then headed back to his room to change. As he stepped into his uniform, he wondered if Martha Stewart had a recipe for monkey bread. Not that he ever wanted to eat it again, but the store-bought stuff really was mediocre. Getting dressed. Burlum's job required that he wear a uniform. When he had first started working at the prefectural, he had been told by another employee, "I used to be so embarrassed to be seen in the uniform that I would come to work in my regular clothes and change once I got here. But now I'm so used to it that I go out to lunch every day in it without any problem at all." Burlum felt sorry for the other man. Niagara made Burlum a lunch every day to take to work. He couldn't conceive of wasting money on going out to eat. As for the uniform, Burlum didn't see anything wrong with it. It was a forest green outfit in wool. The pants had 2 black stripes running up the outside of the legs. The jacket was belted about the waist and had 2 black stripes around the cuffs. Under the jacket he wore an Oxford shirt of light green. Black shoes, a black tie, and the peaked cap completed the look. Above the shiny bill of the cap was the logo of the prefectural, a stylization of the prefectural in brown set on a green hill circled by the words, "Prefectural Caretaker's Force." In addition, Burlum brought a briefcase to work each day. Inside was room for his lunchbox and whatever book he was currently reading. A bed of pictures and wise sayings cut from magazines lined the bottom of the case. Burlum would add the lunchbox to the case just before walking out the door. He was nearly done with his book, so he decided to bring along the next one in the series in case he needed it. Burlum had showered the day before after getting home from work, so the only thing he really needed to do before heading out was brush his teeth. He only shaved every 3rd day on average. He was glad he lived in modern times and a little stubble was acceptable. Wouldn't it be awful, he asked himself, if I had to shave every day just to conform to some crazy standard of acceptable appearance? My face would be a raw mess. Or did one get used to it after a while? Develop calluses, so to speak? Burlum looked at himself in the mirror. Unlike some of his fellow caretakers, he took pride in keeping his uniform neat and clean. He had 3 of them, rotating them every day. He knew of several co-workers who each had only one uniform. These were usually spotted with food stains by the end of the week. He kept his tie knotted snugly in place and didn't allow it to hang loose about his neck. Of course, all of this neatness was helped by the fact that he wasn't a fat slob. It was easy for Burlum to keep his shirt tucked in and the outer belt in place. Some of the other personnel looked quite slovenly in comparison. Not that it mattered much. No one from senior management ever came to the prefectural to say who was a model-looking employee and who wasn't. There were no opportunities for advancement. The tourists who came to visit the prefectural were on average of the same general physical condition as the caretakers. A few thin, a couple muscular, some broken and haggard, but most fat. Burlum put on his cap as he stepped into the kitchen. "Handsome as always," Niagara announced. She handed him his lunchbox and stood beside the door, waiting for a kiss, just like a housewife in a TV show from the 50s. "Thank you," Burlum responded. He looked at the lunchbox, hefting it questioningly. "Rigatoni," Niagara explained. The neighbor. As Burlum walked down his front path to the sidewalk and down the sidewalk to the pickup point for the tram, he was watched closely from across the street by an old man. The old man, whose name was Harold Lurd, stood in the window of his parlor and watched Burlum through a gap in the curtains. He frowned at Burlum's happy, self-contented step. But then frowning was Harold's usual facial expression. The real action was to be seen in the constant stream of muttered invective coming from Harold's mouth. "Bet that uniform itches. Same damn uniform day in and day out. Summer sun or winter chill. Goddamn pervert, so smug in his little world of depravity." "What's that you're saying?" Harold's grown daughter, Lemma, coming into the room with a watering can, asked. Harold stopped talking. "I wish you'd leave that man alone," Lemma implored. She began watering the ferns. Harold turned away from the window. There was nothing more to see anyway. The tram had collected his depraved neighbor and taken him away to that creepy eyesore on the hill. What did he ever do to you? Lemma wondered. Her attention was on her work. She didn't glance at her father until he was nearly out of the room. "He married a robot!" Harold shouted just before he passed through the door. Lemma's mouth twisted as she bit back what she wanted to say. "Put a shirt on," she shouted instead. Harold Lurd went back to his room. He sat down in the easy chair he'd dragged in there 2 years before. He sat for nearly 5 minutes before he got up and put a shirt on. The shirt was a short-sleeved button-up with pictures of horses' heads inside horseshoes all over it. It was older than his daughter and was testimony to the quality of American manufacturing in its heyday, in that it had failed to disintegrate under the rigors of over 50 years of repeated washings. Some, Lemma among them, might argue that the washings the shirt, like its owner, had been subjected to over the years were not quite as regular or as vigorous as one might prefer, but Harold was deaf to such complaints, if any had ever been made in his presence at all. "Suicide," a voice in his head stated quite reasonably, as if listing one of the programs available on morning television. Harold's frown pulled upwards on one side. He was imagining the outpouring of grief and relief that his defunct form would be met with. Certainly Lemma would be relieved. A great burden watering those ferns. Suddenly he wondered if the man across the street, that Burlum, would take any notice of his death. Maybe his wife would tell him when he got home. "There was an ambulance across the street today." Lurd made her voice the sound of effeminate insects in his mind. "Oh, yes." Burlum would sound concerned. His kind always were. They cared about old people, the lonely and decrepit, stuck in houses that smelled of chicken frying and frying and frying for decades on end. "Well, he can be as sympathetic to me as he likes," Harold snapped. "Who can?" Lemma, standing in the hallway with a toilet plunger in her hand, demanded. "Your friend, the robot fucker," Harold simpered, hands limp. Lemma raised the plunger threateningly and castigated her father for his language. Riding to work on the tram. The tram was a medium of mass transport funded by the members of the Wankins Crypts and Monuments Owners Association. Its function was to take the various cemetery workers and monuments caretakers to and from work each day. It also conveyed their wives into town and back, and in the summer their children to the pool. Unlike a bus, the tram was a chain of open-sided cars pulled by a tractor-like vehicle. It didn't go very fast, so there wasn't any need for doors. The cars were covered with green and white striped awnings, and each seated a couple of dozen people on white molded plastic benches. Burlum habitually took a seat on the last car. The tram usually pulled 3 cars, but chains of 2 or 4 were sometimes seen. A few of his fellow prefectural caretakers lived in this area of the city. They all rode next to one another on the last car. They were friendly with some of the men employed at some of the other monuments and cemetery attractions. When Burlum stepped up onto the tram, his co-workers Ned and Lou were already seated and talking to Dwayne and Robert, who worked at the Heroes Vault and the product number Shades, respectively. "Good morning, Burlum," Ned greeted the subject of this chapter. "Good morning, Ned, Lou, Dwayne, Robert." Burlum nodded to each man in turn. He looked about at the other men on the tram, smiling and ready to acknowledge the mute greetings of anyone else who met his eye. "We were just talking about Action Priest," Lou told Burlum. "Did you see it last night?" "No way," Burlum shook his head. "I can't stay up that late." Dwayne and Robert glanced at each other. "Oh, you should have seen it." Lou got excited. He shifted his lumpy rear end about and clawed the air in front of him. "Negron used his tambourine to—" Ned interrupted. "I don't think he knows who that is." "He's the Action Priest," Lou explained with some exasperation. "Surely everyone knew that." "Do you even have a TV?" Dwayne asked Burlum. "Yes, but I don't have cable." "Really? Still using an antenna?" Robert sounded incredulous. "Actually, no. I don't watch broadcast TV. I only use my TV for watching stuff on my DVD player. I even still use my VCR sometimes." "I know what you mean. I've still got a couple things on VHS that have never been issued on DVD." "Really? Like what?" Dwayne wanted to know. Robert shrugged. "Old porn movies." Lou gasped, his unkempt mustache quivering. "Anyway," he insisted, "Negron used his tambourine to dazzle Dr. Thirsty just long enough to steal the ancient book." "The ancient book?" Burlum asked, more to be polite than anything else. "Yes, the whole plot revolves around a lengthy list of commandments in the ancient book." What do you mean, the whole plot? Ned explained. You see, Burlum, TV shows today aren't just about the individual episodes. Stories are stretched out over entire seasons. It's called a story arc. Kind of like the series of books I'm reading. Burlum patted his briefcase. Dwayne and Robert glanced at each other. Clocking in. Just inside the entrance to the prefectural to the right was the old guard room. This is where the time clock was. Burlum, Ned, Lou, and the dozen other men reporting for duty at that hour filed into the room and ran their time cards through the puncher. Their supervisor, Pine, sat behind an old desk that filled a third of the room. It had been suggested that the time clock be moved to the break room, but as the men's lockers were already in there and a measure of anxiety had been expressed on the part of management about allowing such an important piece of machinery out of the supervisor's personal control, it stayed where it was. Of course, because of the cramped conditions in the guard room, a few of the men were forced to clock in late every day. At first, after the installation of the time clock and the doing away with the old manual system of work-hour accountancy, the men were reprimanded for not moving fast enough in the clocking in procedure. This applied to clocking in and out for lunch as well. Obviously, those who clocked out late at the end of the day were eligible for overtime, usually just a minute, but it added up. Eventually, management was forced to allow some leniency on the subject, going so far as to allow a grace period of up to 5 minutes on either side of the official clock-in time. The prefectural was open from 8 in the morning to 8 at night, Mondays through Saturdays. On special occasions, closing time was extended to 10 o'clock or even midnight. There were 2 shifts, morning and afternoon, which overlapped slightly. Burlum was on the morning shift, clocking in at 7 and leaving at 3:30, with a half-hour lunch thrown in. He worked Monday through Friday. A special crew, mostly junior personnel, worked the Saturday shift. Burlum had started out a Saturday man, but managed to get promoted to a regular schedule soon after getting married. Having achieved this position, he had no further ambitions with regard to the job. It had been made clear to him that advancement was a rarity on the order of winning the lottery. Most of the people who worked at the prefectural were there because the work was fairly easy, the benefits were relatively generous, and getting fired was almost unheard of. The vetting process ensured that management had the kind of people who wouldn't screw up in the first place. After clocking in, Burlum went to the break room/locker room and put away his lunch. Again, this was a concession management had been eventually forced to make. It was finally impressed on management that an employee could not be covered by the company's workplace injuries insurance unless they were on the clock, and in order to access their lockers, the employees had to be on the premises. They didn't like it, and of course there was some abuse, caretakers dawdling, and so forth. But on the whole, the system worked fairly well. Certainly Burlum was happy with his job, and management seemed to be happy with him. When I say management, I mean Pine and his assistant Cohen. No one from upper management, the board of directors, the Griffin family, and so on, had any contact with the day-to-day operations of the prefectural or with the caretakers. None of those people knew anything about Burlum, although it is speculated that knowledge of his marriage to a robot had been discussed at some point. Obviously, there was no objection, otherwise he would never have made it to a regular schedule status. Possibly some pretext for his termination would even have been conjured up. As he closed the door on his locker, Burlum turned to Ned with a smile and said, "I'm really in a good mood today." Ned smiled back, but he didn't mean it. Cleaning the old suit of armor. Ordinarily, Burlum would have joined in the general cleanup going on throughout the prefectural in the expectation of the 8 o'clock opening, but today Pine gave him a special task. "Burlum, I need you to clean the suit of armor." Burlum glanced at the object. It stood on a pedestal against the wall between the door leading to the restrooms and the opening to the little room where various artifacts found buried during the construction of the prefectural were kept in glass cases. It looked like one of those jobs that could either take no time at all or all morning. As he had never seen anyone cleaning the suit of armor or heard of anyone being ordered to clean it, Burlum assumed it would be an all-morning job. He turned back to Pine and nodded. "Now, what you're going to need to do," Pine explained, "is take it out back and take it apart. Get some glass cleaner and go over each piece with a rag. Then take some 3-in-1 oil and go over each piece again with that. Give it a good cleaning, a thorough going over." "Okay." Burlum nodded again. He never questioned orders or complained. At first it was just fear of losing his job, but as time went on it became a source of pride with him to distinguish himself from the other caretakers, who almost all complained about every assignment they were given. He continued, "I'm assuming that it hasn't been cleaned in a while?" Pine put his left thumb into the space between the top of his tie and his Adam's apple. "To my knowledge, since I've been here, I don't think it's ever been cleaned," he admitted. Burlum used the hand trucks to cart the suit of armor pedestal as well out to the small concrete pad in the back where the refuse bin and other service equipment was kept. He took off his coat, hat, and tie and set to work. The suit of armor was supported by a dummy that was itself supported by an armature bolted to the wooden pedestal. He decided to do the job as thoroughly as possible. He got a cordless drill out of the little outbuilding where the lawnmower and the other tools were stored. He disassembled everything. The dummy looked obscene once denuded. It was bright pink, of a kind of chalky plastic that nothing was made of today. Under the helmet was a head with a cheerful face and plastic hair that fell out in chunks once disturbed. The decision of what to do about the dummy, for it clearly should be replaced, Burlum would let Pine deal with later. Squatting on an old box, Burlum began cleaning each piece of the armor as instructed. He had been at it for about 2 hours when Vike, one of the caretakers who smoked, came out to have his first cigarette break of the day. "I haven't seen that thing clean since they put it in here," Vike commented, taking out a pack of American Condor menthols. "You remember when it was installed?" Burlum asked, interested. "Yeah," Vike considered. "God, it must have been 20-something years ago." One of the original directors, or investors, or his wife, maybe. I have no idea what the significance of it was. It's got nothing to do with the Perfectual or its ideals. When Vike said ideals, he put a slightly ironic emphasis on the word. I think they just thought it looked good, sort of in keeping with the whole medieval atmosphere of the place. Burlum sat back suddenly, stunned to find a tag sewn into the velvet lining of the breastplate. Talking to a tourist. As it turned out, all morning was taken up with the cleaning. After lunch, Burlum reassembled the armor, reconnected it to the pedestal, and rolled the whole thing back to its traditional place. Pine had instructed him not to worry about the decrepitude of the dummy. "You did a good job," Pine told him, gazing at the armor admiringly. He had had the area of the floor where the armor stood thoroughly cleaned while Burlum was busy outside. "Maybe tomorrow I can get you to work on the display cases?" He pointed to the little room to the left of the armor. "Sure," Burlum agreed. He had actually had fun doing something different for a change. "If you want me to get started now—" No, Pine demurred, wagging his hands. "You go on about your regular duties." At this point of the day, Burlum's regular duties were basically standing around and helping out tourists. He took up a position before the tall, skinny window next to the entrance and grasped his hands behind his back. It wasn't 10 minutes before an old man, visiting the Perfectual for the first time, descended from the stairs that led to the ceiling and staggered within Burlum's reach. "You all right, sir?" Burlum asked, putting a solicitous hand on the old man's shoulder. "I will be, once I get my breath back," the tourist answered. "I think it's harder coming down than it is going up." He placed a hand over his heart, as if to hold it in place. Burlum heard this remark all the time. He even predicted the old man's next one. "Why don't they install an elevator in here?" he asked. "Well," Burlum prepared to launch into his practiced rejoinder. "Besides the fact that it would spoil the aesthetic of the building, an elevator would also make it easy to reach the top, and that would go against the whole philosophy behind the Perfectual. Climbing the stairs to the top is part of one's experience." "Punishment before the reward, eh?" The old man grinned crookedly. "Or trial before enlightenment," Burlum reiterated. "How do you get around the handicap access regulations?" "The Perfectual is registered both as a historical and a religious monument." "Religious?" The old man sounded incredulous. He even jerked at his little hat in an incredulous manner. "It was the only way to keep the building free from alterations imposed from regulatory agencies such as the one you suggested." Burlum liked the way that sentence came out. The old man nodded, musing. He turned his gaze away from Burlum and to the top of the stairs to which he had climbed earlier. His gaze followed the great wishbone tuning fork from the ceiling down to its two ends hanging some 10 feet over their heads. Like the other tourists who visited the Perfectual, he had climbed the stairs and at the top had stretched out his hand and slapped the top of the wishbone tuning fork. This represented the attainment of one's goal, and ensured luck or enlightenment, or the fulfillment of the reasons behind one's pilgrimage. "For me, however," the old man said aloud, contending with thought, "the fulfillment of my journey here was reaching the bottom of the stairs alive." Burlum smiled. He found wisdom in the tourist's words. "Hey!" The old man suddenly brightened up and slapped Burlum on the arm. "Have you ever had anybody die or have a heart attack up there?" Burlum had to admit that, yes, it had happened. Going home. The conversation on the ride home was less about television than about the day's activities, although some measure of the former was in evidence. "Can't wait to see what happens on Action Priest tonight." Ned rubbed his hands in anticipation. "I have to watch Bold Tummy Alphabetical," Lou confessed sarcastically. "Why?" asked Ned. "My wife likes it. She's into all that silly crap." "Shit, I'd rather go tinker in the shed than watch some woman's show," Robert proclaimed. "You do all your tinkering in the shed?" Ned asked slyly, trying to make a joke. "Wait a minute," Burlum interjected. "You said you're going to watch Action Priest tonight?" "Yeah. But didn't you say this morning that you just watched it last night?" Robert and Dwayne looked at each other, shaking their heads. Robert pointed at Burlum with his thumb. "Action Priest comes on every weeknight," Ned explained patiently. "Shows today aren't like shows in the old days," Lou added. "They've got to compete against an increasingly vast array of entertainment options. Having a show on every night is one way of hooking the viewer." "Sounds like the daytime soaps my mother used to watch," Burlum commented. "In a way," Ned admitted. "Say, why did Pine pick you to clean that old suit of armor?" "I don't know. I guess he wanted the job done right." Burlum could make jokes, too, when he wanted. "What suit of armor?" Dwayne asked. "There's a suit of armor next to the restrooms," Lou told him. "Haven't you ever seen it?" Dwayne frowned, raised his eyebrows. "If I have, I don't remember it." "What's a suit of armor doing in the perfectual?" Robert asked. "I have an idea about that." Burlum hadn't meant to say anything, but he suddenly couldn't resist telling what he knew. "While I was cleaning it, I found a tag sewn into the chest piece." He tapped his own chest. "Breastplate," Dwayne offered. "Yeah." Burlum hunched forward conspiratorially. The tag said, "Property of Dr. Murray Fanshang." "Really?" Ned looked flabbergasted. Lou did too. "Who's Dr. Murray Fanshang?" Robert demanded. "He's one of the founders of the Perfectual." It was Dwayne who answered. "We've got him buried at the Heroes Vault." He qualified for burial in the Heroes Vault? Ned found this just as flabbergasting as Burlum's revelation. "He's a founder of the Perfectual," Dwayne repeated by way of explanation. "Yeah, but he's the one who bailed out the whole thing, tried to reveal the secrets." "Yeah, but he's the one who bailed out He's the one who bailed out of the whole thing, tried to reveal the secrets." Lou made the words sound spooky. "That's why," Burlum tapped his knee with his finger, "I think he donated the armor. It's some kind of statement." "Oh, Burlum," Lou chided his fellow caretaker. "His kids probably donated that thing after he died. I heard he was murdered." Robert brought up that old rumor as if it was something none of them had heard before. Watching TV. After a dinner that consisted of more of the same rigatoni he had had for lunch, Burlum went to the little closet where he stored all of his DVDs and old videocassettes. "What do you feel like watching?" he asked Niagara, who sat waiting on the sofa with a mostly ornamental beverage in her hand. "Oh, whatever you want," she replied. "Oh, come on now." Burlum put his head outside the closet. "I really want your input on this." "Well," Niagara bit her upper lip and considered, "what about the flying tent? We haven't seen that in a while." Inwardly, Burlum groaned. It wasn't what he would have picked. If he had given it a moment's thought, he would have known she would pick the flying tent. He made a sound as he disappeared into the closet again. Of course, he thought as he ran his eyes over the all-too-familiar titles, maybe he could be generous and accede to her suggestion. The flying tent was one of the few films in his collection that he hadn't absolutely ruined for himself by too many viewings. He really should get more DVDs. "Got it," he said with a smile as he emerged holding the DVD aloft. Niagara returned the smile and drew her legs up beneath her on the couch in anticipation. Burlum inserted the disc into the machine and took his place on the couch. They didn't snuggle up while watching TV together like some couples. Each leaned on his respective arm of the couch. Burlum had had a problem in the past keeping still during a movie. He would nervously pick at his toes and fingers, sometimes until they bled. But he had found that keeping his socks on alleviated this problem somewhat. Squeezing a tennis ball kept his hands busy while he watched. He longed for the tranquility of a saint. The flying tent dealt with two young men of meager finances and little prospects whose lives were interrupted by the arrival of a young woman from Europe. She convinces them to go camping with her and makes a tent out of an old parachute kept as a souvenir by the old lady that lived downstairs from the two young men. As you can guess from the title of the film, the tent somehow is possessed of magic properties and has the ability to fly, apparently. Whether or not the flying portion of the film represents actual events happening to the trio or is some kind of dream sequence taking place in the minds of one or more of them would be the subject of lively debate among critics if the film was the kind of film that inspires film critics to such debate. However, the flying tent was little known, and generally despised by those critics who had taken notice of it. As the scene in which the two young men find themselves stranded in a vaguely North African environment, the European girl and her tent having disappeared, unfolded, Berlin wondered whether any of his co-workers at the prefectural would appreciate the film's subtleties. He longed to share the film with someone besides Niagara, but knew that its relative quiet and lack of disturbing sexual themes or savage violence would probably confuse other people. As the character Frida, the young woman from Europe, said early in the film, by definition, most people are stupid. Therefore, everything associated with them is stupid. Does this movie have some deep resonance for you? Niagara asked Berlin. The two young men wandered out of shot as camels sniffed at their own droppings. The credits began to flash on the screen. Hey, you picked it out, Berlin reminded her. Niagara nodded thoughtfully.